Is he the greatest African player ever?
I can give you a real short. No.
I agree.
No.
Where does he rank for you though?
I've got Salah in my top 5, but I'm struggling to split between him and Mane, in my opinion.
Seriously?
And I'll be honest with you, for me, the AFCON does play that part.
Definitely.
In terms of African, he's won the actual continent's tournament though.
Has Salah not won it, innit?
No, Salah's not won the AFCON. You're telling me you're the greatest player in
Mohamed
Africa.
Zidane, boy.
I'm tired of people trying to bring down Mo Salah over the fact he never won the African Cup of Nations. Look, I don't even mind if you ignore the fact that he has scored more Premier League goals than Drogba, more UCL goals than Eto'o, or even that he has already outscored George Weah altogether. But to act like his international career has been underwhelming is just disrespectful. It's like people have forgotten about his past. Trust me, with or without an African Cup of Nations to his name, Salah has done more for his people than maybe any other player you could put on that list. Since after all, what many fail to realize is that this was never a fair comparison to begin with, because Mo Salah's journey started on the very same day that Egyptian football died. It was the 1st of February 2012. About a year had passed since the military had overthrown the government of dictator Hosni Mubarak, and as many were led to believe the Arab Spring was cooling down, the revolution was still very much alive among the Al-Ahly ultras. At the peak of protests at Tahrir Square, those same ultras at times deemed hooligans were the ones who stepped in and shielded the protesters from police brutality. Regardless, by the end of the riots, over 800 souls had been lost. Once the military took over, the ultras didn't seem to see any difference between them and the armed forces they had fought over the past weeks. Before you knew it, they were direct enemies, and so on that infamous day, as everyone knew the tension between Al-Masri and Al-Ahly fans would be at an all-time high, the police had no interest in protecting them. So when the fans invaded the pitch following an historic 3-1 comeback, not much was done to contain them, and in the blink of an eye, they were heading towards their rivals looking for blood. While the police made some efforts to protect the players and staff, they barely took a second look at the away supporters, who in an attempt to flee the attacks ended up rushing towards the only gate available, only to find that no one had even bothered to open it. Some were attacked, some fell off the stands, most were trampled and crushed. By the end, 74 had passed away and over 500 were injured. That day, Bill Shankly's famous quote resonated more than ever with Egyptian football fans. Football isn't about life and death. I can assure you it is much more important than that. 1 month later, the league had been cancelled. It would be 2 years before another full league season took place, another 4 before the fans were allowed back in the stands. As a consequence, most of the league's top players fled the country, and some, including even Abu Trika, at the time seen by many as the country's greatest player, announced their retirement. But above all, what worried the fans the most was the national team. Having just become the first ever nation to take 3 AFCON titles in a row, now totaling 7, by 2010, Egypt had established themselves as the strongest football nation in Africa. But as they set their eyes on qualifying for a World Cup for the first time in 24 years, the disaster took place. Instability took over, and by the end of 2011, they had failed to qualify for the African Cup of Nations for the first time since 1978. As they entered the darkest time in their history, they needed someone who could keep that flame burning. In a world without football, the kids needed someone they could aspire to be, but no one could have guessed that hero they looked for was playing for Mokawloon, who had finished at the very bottom of the table just a year before. Though they didn't realize it then, that man was the next king of Egypt. That man was Mohamed Salah. He had only arrived at the club 5 years earlier, aged only 14, and having played academy football for only a year. Before that, all his experience came from either playing on the streets or playing futsal. Even his previous club had only found him by mere chance after they sent a scout to look at some other kid. Regardless, when Mokawloon found him, Salah held on to this one chance as hard as he could. Not even the fact that he lived 4 hours away from their training grounds was enough to stop him. He pretty much dropped out of school and accepted that until he made it, his time would either be spent training, getting to training, getting back from training, or sleeping. As he told ESPN, it wasn't easy. I suffered a lot. But thankfully for him, he wouldn't have to endure that pain much longer. You see, up to that point he had always played as a left back, but then one of the academy coaches moved him up front, and in a flash, he had turned into the most promising player at the academy, even getting his own personal room at their facilities, so he wouldn't have to spend so much time traveling. And that wasn't even the most impressive thing of all. Little more than a year after arriving, at the age of only 15, not only did he join the first team for training, but he even got his debut, becoming the youngest to ever play in the Egyptian league. Less than 2 years later, he became a regular. Little more than a year after that, he had become the club's star. By February of that year, Salah had scored 7 and assisted 3 in just 15 matches, had already been called up to the national team twice, and Zamalek, one of the biggest clubs in the country, were already trying to sign him. But then, well, you know what happened. With his entire world crumbling, over the next few months, the only positive thing Salah could hold on to was his call-up to the Olympic Games, so he joined the team in preparation and hoped something magical would happen. And then, it did. With seemingly every player lacking actual game time, they set up a friendly versus FC Basel, and though Salah would start on the bench, then, with the game tie, they brought him in for the second half, and as the president of Basel described it, "I will never forget what I saw that day on that pitch. It was freezing cold, but it was still amazing. I had never seen a player with so much speed in my entire life." By the end, Salah had scored twice, and against the flow of the match, the Egyptian under-23s had won. Knowing of the situation in Egypt, that same president invited Salah to stay in the city for a week, and less than a month later, Salah had signed with Basel. They knew they could not let a talent like that go to waste, the same way Salah knew he could not let go of this chance. As he said, "I wanted to be the best I could be so that when I arrived at Basel, they would all know they were getting a good player, not some unknown from Egypt." So at every chance he got to play before getting to Switzerland, he made sure to raise the roof, scoring in every group stage match at the Olympics, even against Neymar's Brazil, and then adding a 93-minute winner at the World Cup qualifiers to complete a summer that convinced everyone in Switzerland that Basel had indeed just struck gold. In fact, Salah could not have made the departure of Shaqiri seem any more irrelevant, and no one could have ever guessed how hard it was for him to adapt to life in Switzerland. Despite the cold, despite not knowing a word of the language, despite feeling completely isolated, Salah ran riot on the pitch, even if he was still mostly starting on the bench, totaling 21 goal contributions in just 2,700 minutes of football, and impressing the most in the Europa League, where he led Basel to the greatest campaign in their history. Totaling 5 assists, the most in the competition, and making sure his 2 goals would come precisely against the 2 toughest opponents they faced. First against Tottenham to force their match into a penalty shootout, and then in the semi-finals against Chelsea at the Stamford Bridge, though Basel would fall 1 step short of the final regardless. Still, with a league trophy to ease his sorrow, Salah went into the next season's World Cup qualifiers at full throttle, smashing 3 past Zimbabwe and scoring the winner versus Mozambique to leave Egypt 1 win away from the World Cup playoffs. Then, going back to Switzerland, scoring 3 goals in 4 Champions League playoff matches to ensure their place in the competition in what I can only guess was a warm-up, only to then come back and add the final blow versus Guinea, which not only put them in the playoffs, but also made Salah the qualifiers' top scorer. Regardless, just as he was 1 step away from bringing joy back to his people, Ghana destroyed them 6-1 in the first leg and all hope faded away. And with the Egyptian league still suspended, the last thing the fans could hold on to was Salah himself. But thankfully for them, over the next 6 months, not only did he take his league performances to a whole new level, but he met Chelsea in the Champions League twice and made sure to score on both occasions, making it now 3-3 against the Blues and getting every Premier League club on his tail during the winter transfer market, getting within inches of joining Liverpool, only for 1 call from Jose Mourinho to be enough to change his mind completely. But though it made sense at the time, though Chelsea was the more dominant team, they also had everyone from Hazard, Lukaku, Oscar, Ramirez, Willian, Torres, Eto'o and Schürrle, and with Mourinho being notorious for rarely changing his starting lineup, as Salah would one day admit, "Looking back, I was given the wrong advice." By the end of that first season, he had only been afforded 500 minutes on the pitch. It honestly looked as if his career had stagnated, and next season, it only got worse. In October, after only managing to beat Shrewsbury Town thanks to an own goal, Mourinho personally criticized Salah, claiming he felt he had been let down. A month later, Egypt missed out on qualification to yet another African Cup of Nations, and by January, with only 3 Premier League appearances to his name, as Salah said himself, "My dream was slipping away, and I didn't want to be a victim. I had 2 options, to accept they were right for putting me on the bench, or to prove them wrong. So I felt like, no, I need to go." By the next month, Salah was already joining Fiorentina on loan, and to remind himself why he was playing, he made sure to wear the number 74 on his back, in honor of the 74 victims of the Port Said disaster. All he wanted was to make his people proud, and 6 matches in, he was already on 5 goals. By the end of the season, he had shown up time and time again with goals against the likes of Juventus, Inter and Tottenham, and Fiorentina had not only secured their highest finish in the league in 15 years, but had made it to the Europa League semi-finals, their most successful European run since the Baggio era. When it was time to extend his loan, they did not even think twice. In the words of their own president, "We made him an insane offer." But nevertheless, Salah rejected it, completely breaking their hearts. They even tried to file a complaint to FIFA to keep their star man on board, but it was too late. Salah was already off to Rome, and he was just tremendous there. After an injury to his right ankle 3 months into this new chapter, it wouldn't have been too far-fetched to assume that his momentum would be halted once more. But after 8 matches without a goal, out of nowhere Salah took a leap to a whole new level. 10 goals and 6 assists in 18 matches before the end of the season, making sure Fiorentina went undefeated for 5 months, taking them from being 6 points off of a Champions League spot to being 13 points ahead of 4th place Inter. Not just being named the club's player of the season, but being their top scorer as well. While Chelsea accepted an offer of only 15 million euros for his signing, I'll never understand. But what I do know is that then, Salah finally managed to put Egypt back in the African Cup of Nations with 4 goals in 4 qualifying matches, and suddenly, he was a man on a mission. 1,000 minutes of game time into the season, he was already on 13 goal contributions, and though then an injury stopped him in his tracks once again, by the time he was back, the moment he had been waiting for was upon us. It was time to join Egypt for the African Cup of Nations. After a goalless opening match, Salah assisted the only goal versus Uganda, then he scored the only goal versus Ghana to put them in the knockouts, and after a narrow win against Morocco, it was again Salah who scored the only goal in the semi-final. But then, though he assisted the opener in the final with 2 minutes to go, the Egyptian defense collapsed and Aboubakar scored to turn the match around. Salah was inconsolable. Not even winning his first African Player of the Year award was enough to appease him, but as always, he didn't wallow in his own misery. He held his head high and kept on going. By the end of the season, he was on 34 goal contributions in 3,100 minutes of football, had led Roma to the highest points tally in their history, had taken the Player of the Season award, but most importantly of all, it was finally time to go back to the Premier League and show them what he had been missing. And after a club record 42 million euros, Liverpool finally got the man they had been hunting for years. And no matter how many fans insisted that he was nothing but a Chelsea flop, a reject, that he was destined for failure, that they would be better off signing Aaron Lennon, Klopp trusted him, and 2 months later, he had already scored 6 and assisted another. But before he doubled back on all of that, the biggest game of his career had arrived. It was the decisive match of the World Cup qualifying stages, Egypt versus Congo. If Egypt won, they would be in the World Cup for the first time in 28 years, and all responsibility had been laid on Salah's shoulders. He could not budge, and so, after a little more than an hour of game time, it happened. Salah had scored, but as the clock approached the 90-minute mark, Congo tied the match. In Salah's own words, "I could hardly comprehend what I saw. I just couldn't accept that we wouldn't qualify. I was totally crushed. I fell to the floor, but as soon as I hit the ground, I realized that my teammates could not see me like that. So, I forced myself back up. But even as I did, I was burning inside. I'd say that was probably the hardest moment of my life." 3 minutes into injury time, a player fell in the box and the referee pointed to the penalty spot. As the stadium erupted, as most of the Egyptian staff ran into the pitch, as the commentator repeatedly thanked God for that moment, one man stood still. Mo Salah was the one tasked with making that miracle come true. And then, he did. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Egypt were back in the World Cup. In Salah's own words, it was a special moment for all, but to qualify in that manner, the world's greatest writers would struggle to come up with an ending like that. But that's where Salah was wrong. that wasn't the ending. Fueled by that moment, over the next 7 months, Salah played one of the greatest seasons in the history of the Premier League. 32 league goals not only earned him the Golden Boot, but were enough to break the league's all-time goal-scoring record. When the awards were handed out, he took every single one available. From the FWA to the PFA, the FSF, the Premier League itself, and even the fans named him the Player of the Year. It was only the second time in history that it ever happened, but none of that even accounted for his Champions League campaign. 10 goals and 4 assists in less than 900 minutes up until the final. No player from Africa or Liverpool had ever hit double digits in the competition. In fact, no opponent had been left untouched. Salah scored against every team he faced, but as Liverpool reached their first final in 11 years, as Salah got within inches of closing off one of the greatest campaigns of all time, 30 minutes into the final, Ramos nearly broke his arm, and Salah was carried out in tears. Without him, Liverpool lost and ended the season without a single trophy. And to make it all that much more worrying, then it was announced there was a chance Salah would not be recovered in time for the World Cup. In Egypt, the cries echoed across the country. One newspaper deemed Ramos public enemy number 1. Another claimed that its people would never forgive him. A lawyer even tried suing him for $1 billion, citing physical and psychological harm to the nation of Egypt. Thankfully, Salah somehow still made it to the World Cup, and even though he would have to be rested for the first match, watching his team crumble under Uruguay, even though he would lose the second match despite scoring a penalty, by the time he loved the Saudi goalkeeper to open the scoreboard in the next match, even if it was already impossible for Egypt to qualify to the next stage, none of it mattered. That was Egypt's first open play goal at a World Cup since 1934. It was the first time in their history they were ahead in the world's greatest competition. In that moment, that was all that mattered. Hope had been restored in Egypt, and its people could not be more proud of their son.